Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see so many of you here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Okwek Penyon, the Chair of Memorial 2007. And I'd like to welcome you all this evening, both old friends and new, for whom this is the first visit for a memorial lecture. After the pandemic and last year's industrial action on the transport system, it's good to be back again and resume the lectures. I want to give a special welcome to the new Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Professor Kingsley Abbott, who has joined us from New Zealand via Bangkok. Without the support of the Institute, these lectures... Without the support of the Institute, these lectures would not take place, and we thank the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for their support. I'd also like to thank my fellow trustee, Audrey Edwards, who has worked very hard with me in organising the lecture, and Kay Masunda from the university, who has been very supportive in dealing with my many requests. My thanks also to the other volunteers who have contributed to making this evening happen. Since we last met, one of our patrons, Lady Kate Davson, the 3 times great-granddaughter of William Wilberforce, has died. And we have now lost another patron, not to death, but the former Archbishop of York, Dr. John Sentamu, when he retired, he resigned all his patronages. So we give thanks posthumously to Lady Kate, and we also thank John Sentamu. Now, I just want to flag up a couple of things. Firstly, should there be a fire, you don't use that door which says emergency exit, please, because it doesn't go anywhere. So what you have to do is go out the door that you come through, and Kay, and come up, Kay, so people can see. Kay will lead you down the stairs and out through the rear of Senate House, and people will gather outside the Students' Union of SOAS. So this is Kay. She's dressed in appropriate bright colour, so you can't miss her. The other thing, toilets. The toilets, out through the door, turn left through the swing doors, across the corridor, through the other swing doors, and the toilets, lots of swing doors. The toilets are on the right-hand side. And finally, telephones. If you've got a mobile on, can you put it on silent or switch it off, please? Because this is being recorded and we don't want to have any interruptions. Now, I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to our speaker this evening, the Chancellor of Oxford Brookes University, actor and author Paterson Joseph.
To our ancestors. Distinguished guests, my brothers and sisters of the African diaspora, allies and friends, it is my great honor and privilege to address some remarks to you on the subject of a permanent memorial to the lives of the millions of stolen, exploited, and murdered souls who lost their lives during Britain's involvement in the wicked transatlantic slave trade. I'm a Britain-born black man. My parents came from St. Lucia, then a British colony, in 1958. I was the 5th of what would be 6 children that they had here. I grew up in Willesden Green in northwest London and went to school for the first time in the late 60s. I was part of that cohort of young African Caribbean kids who were labeled educationally subnormal. There's a BBC documentary called Subnormal that touches on some of the horrors and injustices of that systemic racism. We were treated as if we had a naturally inferior intellect. Some of us here experienced that treatment in mild or harsh form in our academic lives. Some of us managed to thrive despite this. But a lot of us struggled. My story. I rejected school as soon as I was able and began to play truant, or bunked off, as the phrase went, from the age of 13. I got lucky in that my only desire was to read. I hid in Willesden Green Library for as much of the day as I could. In those days, I read everything, some of it excellent and some just rubbish, like the countless Mills and Boon novels my sister collected. Romantic novels for the ladies, in case you're wondering, young people. Books were an escape, the greatest form of storytelling. Squiggles on a page become pictures in your head, perfect, indelible, and unique to you, unforgettable. I loved the old novels, like Dickens' Oliver Twist, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Later, I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. I loved the skill with which these writers used the English language. In fact, it changed the way I pronounced words, for a start. This accent is not a result of drama school, but of reading and my habit of reading out loud. See, once I knew how a word was spelt, it became difficult not to pronounce those words as they were laid out. And it made me a bit of a weirdo, of course. Imagine being in a Kensal-Rise shebeen in 1980 and in the darkened club asking a girl with this accent, "Would you like to dance?" Like I was in a formal ballroom with the Pride and Prejudice lot. Hopeless and, yes, unsuccessful, mostly. Don't feel sorry for me, I got over it. Mostly. In those novels and in the literature I was imbibing, I did not feel the loss of connection with characters because they were not black. I learnt then that human beings can empathize with other human beings because of our shared humanity. Yet I also felt a sense of a missing part of those stories. What were black people doing while these protagonists were going through their lives? And the deeper questions. Were there any black people in the UK before the mid-20th century? And if so, where is the obvious evidence for such a presence? Are the fragmentary rumors of this black presence a hidden truth or just wishful thinking by those who feel, more accurately, are made to feel they do not belong here? I didn't happen to grow up in an environment of intellectuals or academics, historians or activists. I had no links to those who knew our story either. People who need to have 3 jobs to sustain their family cannot always be expected to teach them history too. That should be the job of the academic system. But, like most of us in this country, I was taught very little about black history outside of a footnote about slavery, abolition, and Britain's colonial enterprise. To find our history, you had to either be lucky enough to have weekend classes, a black-led after-school club, or attend a rare black-run school, or even more rarely, know someone who knew all about this black history stuff. Failing that, my black history came to me ad hoc, randomly, snippets from some unreliable sources at times. So ignorant I remained, doing what most black Britons do, just getting on, getting around, or getting under all the objects in my way due to the color of my skin. That's a full-time job, and I had no time to dwell on history. Or so I thought. Turns out it mattered to me to know that history. How else was I going to answer that tedious question, where are you really from? And if I would struggle to answer those sometimes simply curious, oftentimes plainly racist questions, how would my son be able to answer them? And not just because of the person interrogating me, but my own sense of who I am, where I belonged, would always be in question. This is not a way to live. I needed to know. And in my mid-30s, I set out to do just that. It was an act of curiosity that led me to Charles Ignatius Sancho. Sancho's life ended up being the ideal form in which I could explore these questions of history, belonging, and truth. Here are the fragments of his story. Charles Ignatius Sancho was born on a slave ship, orphaned by the age of 2, baptized in Colombia, shipped to England to live with 3 unmarried women in Greenwich. They treated him like an object. He would have looked like, these shamefully unnamed children. A pet, an ornament. An accessory that showed your wealth and global influence. Chained humanity to prove one's high status. Wicked. Inhumane. And these shows of ostentation are all over Europe. England was, of course, far from an exception. Sancho ran away briefly from the 3 unmarried women he was pet to because, according to Sancho and his biographer, Joseph Jekyll, they would not teach him how to read, presuming that ignorance was the best guarantee of obedience. Yet even now, we hear black children accuse other black kids who love to read of trying to be white. It's propaganda at its most effectively self-destructive. Sancho was found in Blackheath Park by a man who believed in the controversial idea of black intelligence, John, Duke of Montagu. He gave Sancho secret access to his library, and the clever young man devoured everything he could lay his hands on. Later, free, he became a musician, a highly accomplished composer, publishing at least 3 existing works of music, and wrote a play that we are still on the lookout for. His music is wonderfully joyful, and his portrait by Gainsborough in 1768 astonishing. Sancho was deeply knowledgeable about the art world, his skill in the area of the letter-writing art, the art of the epistolary art, as they called it. Added to his fame. So he's the first known man of African descent to vote, to to receive to the first known person of African origin in the UK to be patron to an artist, the first to vote in a British parliamentary election, the first to receive an obituary in a national newspaper, and other notable achievements. All the while, being a vocal anti-slavery voice before the abolitionist movement had really taken off. A staunch monarchist, he worked for the Montagues, courtiers very close to the throne. Sancho wasn't a fan of republicanism, certainly in the form that he saw rising out of Britain's disputes with the soon-to-be United States. He desperately wanted America to remain in the bosom of Britain's global family. See, these facts are a mosaic of deeds and events. I have no idea where any of that went, but there we are. I wonder if we shut that, we'll just get blank. Will we get blank? No, why not? That's very tricky anyway, it's slowing me down. You can imagine what I'm saying. So these facts are a mosaic of deeds and events, pieces of a man, as Gil Scott-Heron sang. They are not the man himself. Finding a way to round these fragments up to create a coherent, memorable whole was the challenge I set myself in my monodrama, Sancho, an act of remembrance, and more immersively in my recent novel, The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho. This seemed most urgent to me, as I believe that without a knowledge of our forerunners, we can have little or no context for what we're living through today, or how we might deal with larger ideas around slavery reparations and an acknowledgement of Britain's most brutal and negative past. I'm on the road in 2018. I'm performing in Harlem at the National Black Theatre. In the Q&A, I'm asked a question that has come up several times since I started touring my monodrama, Sancho, an Act of Remembrance, in 2016. Did Britain ever have slavery? This is not as ignorant a question as you might imagine, because how else can Britain be perceived except by the story it tells itself and the world? There was a bit of slavery, then Britain came to her senses, and with the help of great white men like William Wilberforce, ended the trade on moral grounds. 2,000 sailors lost their lives in blockading the other European slave trading nations, and we are, therefore, heroic and exonerated from all guilt because of this heroism. A lie. And a conveniently effective piece of innocence propaganda. It still resonates today. Please seek out the film A Story of Bones on the British territory of St. Helena, as championed by Peggy King Jord. St. Helena, where thousands of Africans were abandoned after being rescued by the British Navy. These tragic souls are still in need of a respectful burial, denied them by the UK government to this day. Here are some more home truths. I'm indebted to Professor Hakim Adi, whose forthcoming publication, African and Caribbean People in Britain, is a must-read for all those interested in the history of the black presence in the United Kingdom. Much of what follows will hopefully form part of my chapter in the new work, The Cambridge Companion to Charles Ignatius Sancho. The failure to connect Britain to its colonial exploits and exploitations is not an accident. The idea that Britain was the land of the free, that it could never, never, never support slaves, it's an insidious lie that has permeated thoughts on Britain and slavery for many centuries and continues to this day. This national amnesia has been aided and abetted by teachers and the historians who have been instructing those teachers from at least the time of Britain's first ventures into the role of colonizer in the 1600s until today. Did Britain ever have slavery? When I explained to an American audience that Britain was the chief Western enslaving nation, that they had the license granted to them early in the 18th century to procure African captives for other European nations that traded in these souls, I met with looks of shock. British audiences do not fare much better. I've had many people approach me after question and answer sessions to confess that though they received first-class degrees in history at Oxford or Cambridge, they were totally unaware of a black history until the moment I introduced Sancho and his world to them. There's anger there, too, when they realize they've been sold a story that glossed over Britain's part in this foundational piece of human cruelty. Foundational because slavery, African chattel slavery, is the basis of so much of the world's economy, from banking to insurance, stocks, and shares. In order to contextualize who Sancho was, how extraordinary his achievements and how significant his final act, the vote, we must look at the world in which he was born and the stage on which his life was lived. From 1609 onwards, Britain began to acquire overseas territories in an ambitious attempt to expand the empire. Beginning in that year with Bermuda, British adventurers, aka state-sanctioned pirates, went on to grab Virginia and Massachusetts in North America, and by 1632 had colonized Barbados, Antigua, Nevis, and Montserrat. The significance of these land grabs for Africans cannot be underestimated, for it was the need for cheap labor who could more readily support the brutal working conditions in those tropical climates that led to the beginnings of Britain's trade in African captives. It is true to say that Britain transported white criminals, as well as the Irish, who were political prisoners Oliver Cromwell wanted to see removed as far from the British Isles as possible, and other undesirables. As the brilliant historian Eric Williams stated, white servitude was the historic basis upon which Negro slavery was constructed. However, the industrial trade in African captives was left to Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and Holland to take to another level altogether. On top of which, we must add the stripping of heritage, language, culture, and humanity from those African souls that was not mirrored in the terrible treatment of white indentured laborers. Theirs was a harsh life, it is not to be doubted, but where Sancho's parents, had they lived, would have ended up, would have been more inhumane still. In 1655, when England under Cromwell seized Jamaica from Spain, several state monopolies sprang up to more efficiently steal Africans to work the plantations there, particularly the burgeoning sugarcane fields. Britain's consolidation of territories in West Africa followed, in order for them to more readily facilitate the traffic of human souls across to their Caribbean possessions. The vicious so-called triangular slave trade was established. One of these monopolies was the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading in Africa, which was established in 1660 after the restoration of the monarchy, winning an exclusive charter to trade in African captives in 1663. The Royal Africa Company was established in 1672 after the original company ran into financial difficulties. This was a much expanded operation, including troops, forts and factories in West Africa, as well as the right to exercise martial law in a grab for land, gold, silver, and humans. Even before 1663, however, it is estimated that Britain's state-sanctioned privateers, pirates, had already transported over 100,000 Africans across the Atlantic to supply free labor for Britain's slave-worked plantations. At least 10,000 Africans a year from 1663 to 1673 were brutally wrenched from their homes to work without pay or recompense in the cruel slave system. So much wealth was generated by this inhumane and criminal activity that a new coin was minted in 1663, the golden guinea, made from African gold and stamped with the crest of the company, an elephant and castle. Yes, that elephant and castle. In its many years of trading, the shareholders of the Royal African Company included Charles II and the royal family, over a dozen Lord Mayors of London, aristocrats, writers, composers, and philosophers, including Samuel Pepys, John Locke, and George Friedrich Handel. Slavery was embedded into the very establishment of early empire building, commerce, and power. Those trading in captured Africans had only one faint qualm, perhaps, when a group of these men demanded to know whether black captives could be considered mere goods. The legal opinion from the Solicitor General: Negroes ought to be esteemed goods and commodities within the acts of trade and navigation, thus dehumanizing Africans in the process. The new business of Great Britain, formed by the Act of Union in 1707, was human trafficking. Professor Hakim Adi rightly concludes. The Bank of England and the national debt were created in 1694. These were established to raise finances, to carry on the trade in captured Africans, and to fight Britain's wars, mainly against that other slave-driven superpower, France. These wars led to the famous Treaty of Utrecht, which granted Britain the rights that are known as Asiento de Negros. Not many people have heard of the laws of Asiento de Negros. Not many people. I found out about this very recently. But it pertains to Sancho's life story in a most significant way. This law, put into motion in 1713, just a decade or so before Sancho was born, granted Britain the exclusive monopoly of trading in African souls for 30 years. Since Sancho's slave ship landed in Colombia, I had presumed his life was connected not to the British slave economy, but to the rival Spanish one. However, Asiento gave the UK the right to transport captive Africans for the Dutch, the Portuguese, and to the many Spanish slave-driving colonies, as well as Britain's own. The United Kingdom had a hand in Sancho's life from the very beginning. The need for the enslaved Africans' memorial is more urgent now than ever, as this nation has the habit of shutting down arguments about reparations before they are even laid out. Britain wasn't as bad as America or Belgium or France, many say, regurgitating an opinion based on a wildly, inaccurately curated history. Curated history. Cherry-picked facts that paint a picture of near innocence and enlightenment, rendering us complacent of our place in the cruelest human trafficking story humanity has ever known. But rather than beginning with acknowledgement, PM Sunak, in reaction to the pronouncement by Justice Robinson of the International Court of Justice, who declared that Britain was in danger of being an isolated nation in its refusal to even acknowledge its full part in the wicked trafficking of African souls, declared that there would be no apology and no reparations. The wickedness continues. Oku Ekpenyon calls this political amnesia. Coincidentally, I have long called this national amnesia. Like a family, a nation forgets who they are at their peril. It is a crisis of existential importance because without history, without knowing the truth of who you are, what you've done, good and bad, there can be no true self-knowledge, nor indeed self-improvement. We see this manifestly in the stagnant thinking around the truth of Britain's deep involvement in the international trade in African lives. I'd like to take a moment to breathe humanity into my address and read from my new novel, The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho. Individual stories are the best way to look at monumental tragedies. And to me, this is not polemic. It's personal. Why did I write The Secret Diaries in novel form? I wrote in novel form because I considered it the most intimate way in which a story can be conveyed. Squiggles on a page become ideas in your head, formed, that are indelible. They're indelible and above all unique to us. Those images are permanent and they are unforgettable. I wrote the monodrama, Sancho, An Act of Remembrance, after seeing the portrait, reading his letters, all of these public shows. Portraits are performances. The letters, too, were performative, since relatively few people could read, of course. So these letters were often read aloud by the woman or man of the house to their family. Obviously, you couldn't say everything. There's a curation involved in that. His letters to the newspapers, of course, he's also curating so that he can speak to the powers that be in the language and manner that would be most effective for getting his point across. The music he wrote, well, they weren't dirges and songs of sorrow. No, he wrote lively dance music, popular music, militantly joyful music, I call it. It might be equated to the rise of the raucous dance music scene, techno and kwaito, amongst South African youth post-apartheid. Well, they weren't dealing with activism, they just wanted to be free to dance. And they, like Sancho, were criticized for it too. But again, that's all public. What was his private life like? So, I performed the actor's trick of hot-seating Sancho, asking him what it felt like internally to live with three sisters who treated him as their pet in Greenwich in the 1730s. What was it like to have a duke as your patron? What did it feel like to have a black wife, his beloved hen, his best self, the love of his life, Anne Osborne, and raise 8 children in the middle of Westminster? What was it like to own a grocery store and sell goods produced by slavery? What was it like to have the chance to be the first black person that you know of to vote? And so, as you'll hear, the novel begins with him addressing himself to the person he most wants to know his story before he passes. Prologue, 1775, 46 years old. Time away from one's diary is as valuable as a little time away from one's lover. Absence not only softens the tender feelings toward the beloved other, It also provides the benefit of perspective that renders the object of affection so much more precious and beautified. So too with quill, ink, and leaf, I reunite my body with my mind, and the pleasure this act gives me has grown rather than diminished. For I speak and write to purpose now. I seek to lay forth a history that speaks of all the truths of my life up to this present day, to survey, like the architect of my own life, the line I have followed that brought me here, my history. Not chaotically rendered as in my earliest diary entries, no, as I see them now, put together to make sense of the whole. This for you, my son, William Leach Osborne Sancho. Born last Friday, the 20th day of October, at exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. My second son, my only living son. I will speak to you as you will be, as I see you in my mind's eye, when you will find these pages carefully concealed in my old room at Windsor Castle. I speak to Billy, the gentleman. The instructions for finding these will be given to you before I pass. I know with a certain knowledge that I will not live to see you at man's estate. And so, here am I, addressing the man, Billy Sancho. Know thy father and forgive him. I will not stint on necessary detail, but have no time for flights of fantasy, nor anecdote not pertinent to my aim, neither, which is no less than to render the truth of a complex web of a life lived in many kingdoms, or so it seems to me presently. I'm now a shop owner, but hold, enough. I gallop ahead. I must grasp the reins of my memory more firmly. Now, much of the following comes from my diary entries over the years. I will record my retrospective interjections. So these may be useful in aiding my Billy to navigate the story of his father's life thus far. This rendering may benefit older Sancho too, when time has eroded precision in recollection of even the most momentous twists and turns of a long life. I began writing a diary in earnest at the age of 17. Those entries will appear in these pages as I see fit. For the present, I will begin at the beginning. Book 1, Chapter 1, in which Charles Ignatius Sancho relates his early life. 1729, Origins. I had, on reflection, little right to survive. Born on a slave ship, crossing the Atlantic Ocean on what is quaintly described as the Middle Passage. I now say a slave ship is neither in a passage, nor does it navigate the middle of anywhere. It sails straight to the heart of hell. My future articulacy would have astounded my master. Standing a safe distance from the helpless African girl of unknown origin, a daughter of Eve from somewhere along the Guinea coast. Neither would it have occurred as a possibility to my terrified boy father, traumatized by the last day's events, emasculated for fear of the unknown. In contrast, his wife, my mother, is simply, luckily, lost in the bewildered agony of a painful breech birth. Lucky to be together at all, these child parents, captured and sold as slaves, I would guess, by a rival tribe's chief, the human spoils of war. Lucky. A charnel house of black flesh, this. Cramped and rank with rat droppings and the spillage of 1,000 filthy slop buckets. Filth amassed over the 15 years of this ship's barbaric life. A life spent plying its brutal, unfeeling trade between the pestilential slaughterhouses of the Guinea or slave coast and the slow death of plantation life that awaited the cursed souls who were doomed to never return home, neither they nor their offspring. A permanently lost tribe. Let us roam, leaving the child parents to their agonies for a moment. Let us venture to the next deck down. No, not that lower mezzanine deck, that one's for the pickaninnies. Oh, they can really pack them in there. Conveniently small, these little ones, they hardly complain at all, but simply lie in stupefied terror. All the better. Much less trouble that way. Quieter. No, we need to look at the lowest deck. We find the men's quarters, quite the largest space in the ship, roomy. Or at least it would be. If 300 men were not crammed head to toe so tightly that no room can be afforded for the slightest movement without feeling the calloused skin of a stranger's feet or the tangled woolly roughness of the hair of one's neighbor, pungently ripe with sweat and the acrid smell of fear and death. The rhythmic ruling of the ship, accompanied by the groans of hundreds of men who cannot speak nor understand each other's languages. Divide and rule starts early in the seasoning process. Yes, that shameless word for the conditioning for a life of slavery that the white and black traders along this treacherous coast give to the slave apprenticeship. An apprenticeship that starts in earnest once the enslaved soul has reached their destination, usually a plantation of one kind or another, cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, crops that bring ready money, commerce. Where will your cruelty end? Let us hurry back up to the berth cabin. Our young mother-to-be is about to bring our main subject forth, past the mid-deck with the women and young girls deck, half the area of that of the men, and made more uncomfortable for them for the fact that some are in similar stages of pregnancy as Our Lady above, who now we see has expired. There is the dumbstruck master, the surgeon charged with midwifery duty, guiltily sullen. The near catatonic gaze of the frightened boy father, now without a soul who knew him free. He has the fleeting notion to bolt from the room, perhaps to fling himself overboard, broken by the loss of his wife, his life's companion. Futile, he will be shackled below with the rest. And what of the debris left in the wake of this storm of grief? The mewling, puking infant boy, soon baptized Charles Ignatius, after the founder of the Jesuits, and growing strong and round, always round, in New Granada. On arrival, Billy, when first my father, your grandfather, saw that the colour of the majority of labourers on that benighted dock matched his own, he set his eye on a dozing overseer's unguarded scabbard, seized the man's sword, then swiftly slipped the blade from his own guts to his heart before any had time to register the act. He died in merciful seconds, and my world contracted yet again. This story I have pieced together from fragments I harvested from servants' gossip, the indiscretions of my guardians, my own meditations, my nightmares. My story is just that, a story, neither better nor worse than any enslaved orphan of Afrique. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I've got more to say. Do you want to stop me?
No, I don't. I think.
No. I mean, I'm about to dance with Anne Sancho, so perhaps Oku was saying you want to join me in the dance that I'm about to.
No, definitely not.
Have I gone on too long? Isn't that what?
No, carry on.
Okay.
I mistook your pause.
Oh, yeah, it's too dramatic, wasn't it? Too long. Okay. I'll get on with it. So thankfully, Sancho's story is not one of unrelenting misery. He is battered by circumstances, but rallies every time. Fast forward to Sancho at 23. He's away from the ladies, who he calls the Greenwich Coven, or the Sisters Three, as in Macbeth's witches, and has escaped to London. It's a harsh life. And he spends a lot of his little money and most of his time in living a wild life, according to his letters, away from the path of purity. He cleans up his act, works as a musician where he can, and also for the late Duke's family. One of these occasions has him meeting an older black man called John Clark Osborne, who invites him to see how the African entertains themselves in London. He heads to a tavern on Fleet Street known to be frequented by black people. I call it the Black Tar Tavern. Tar as in sailor. Because every ethnicity that sailed the Atlantic is there. Indian Lascars, Arabs, Irish, African and Caribbean blacks, and they are reveling. Imagine that eclectic music and those dances. White observers never really describe it, but I attempt to in the secret diaries. Now, as Sancho sits exhausted after dancing the lively jigs, Clark Osborne comes to take him to see his family. And Sancho meets for the first time Mrs. Clark Osborne, Mary, and the woman who would come to mean everything to him, the young Anne Osborne. Anne Osborne. If I could write the beauty of your eyes, and in fresh numbers number all your graces, the age to come would say this poet lies, such heavenly touches ne'er touched earthly faces. At the risk of being accused, as Shakespeare's sonneteer would have it, of lying to future generations, you, Billy, about the beauties of my love, I fortuitously attempted to conjure the impression that my first encounter with Anne Osborne left me with on the very night it occurred. What is attractive beyond resisting to one is a matter of great indifference to another. What in one culture and place will be considered beauty is subject to local matters of taste and habituation. However, what we are told represents beauty can on occasion be contradicted by what we find to be attractive directly before us. Nothing could have persuaded me to accept this night what the Greenwich Coven had often expressed, the belief that black humanity lacked the aesthetic beauty of the European. My rare encounters with black women had not given me sufficient ammunition to fully counter this foolish notion. Until today. That love blinds the eye of the observer in love is plainly and painfully true. There will be many examples where a man of seemingly low prospects finds a woman willing to sacrifice her freedom to his desires, though all her circle cry foul at her choice. What she sees, no other can perceive, and one would have the devil of a time convincing, say, the bride to an ogre that he was deformed beyond repair. So powerful an ocular delusion does love administer. In this case, I need make no excuses. For only a man blinded from birth and without the knowledge of what is considered human beauty could be oblivious to the charms and graces of that most extraordinary creature, Anne Osborne. She sat with an easy poise that belied her 19 years, and spoke with an economy of gesture and movement that was at once free and decorous. Her skin was the color of milk-drenched cocoa, and her complexion remarkable. It was as if a light glowed from within that rendered the skin on the surface radiant and bright. Her clear brown eyes, so peaceful and gentle behind her long eyelashes, were mesmerizing to me. I became lost in them from time to time before I shook myself and tried to engage in the conversations happening around the table. I took in very little of the subjects under consideration. I could only nod encouragingly every so often to the speaker to give the impression that I was engaged. At one time, when I had forgotten to pretend to be listening, Anne Osborne turned her full gaze upon me, and I burned from within. I had the sense of being in the presence of a great person, a person with a large and generous heart, who knew kindness as a fixed virtue of her personality. I felt that I could talk to such a one for many hours, and that I would, like Othello, receive from my Desdemona a world of sighs. So sympathetic was her look to all around her. As the band started up again and the dancers were rising around the room, I thought it was time I did something other than just sit and stare. And so I requested a dance from the pretty creature. She refused. I barely asked the question when John and Mary leapt up, and the pair immediately started swerving and dipping and swaying as if they had danced with each other 100 times before, which assuredly they had. I turned away from them, envious, left alone with the woman who had just rejected me. I tried to affect nonchalance, but I felt anything but. She sipped her wine for a moment, observing me, then gracefully moved into the chair that her father had occupied and leant in to address me. And now I could catch the flavors, so many flavors of her accent. Hints of London, yes, but Jamaican too? And was there something of a Cornish tint to her beautiful alto lilt? My eardrums vibrated deliciously as she spoke directly into my ears. I have heard much of you, Sancho. I cannot believe you intend to ask me only once to dance. Father spoke of your determination to succeed in life. I see little evidence of that tonight. And with a look so mischievous that I was struck dumb, she took my hand and led me out to the roiling dance floor. The jig was bouncing along in a jaunty fashion when we first stood up, but shifted, to my relief, to a more romantic mood as we stepped onto the floor. Only tabor, French horn, and flute played this stately minuet-like tune. I hesitated to know what to do for a moment, and so took my cue from the Clark Osbornes, holding each other very close while they moved as one in a graceful dance, making them appear to be moving through thick air. It was sensual in the extreme. I confess to finding it a little salacious to observe. I accepted the admonition to imitate the Romans when in Rome, and took hold of Anne's tiny waist, pulling her to me. The heat that rose between us was unmistakable. Her body was firm and lithe, and her movements delicate and minimal. For a precious few moments, she let me hold her to me. I felt every pulse of her form and noted every turn of her fine and articulate feet as she pulled away from me to dance alone, facing me. It struck me that this was a mating ritual, one in which I had never been initiated. Anne glided like a danseuse. I know that I was not the only man in that tavern to think she the most graceful and beautiful woman there. This mating music had no firm time signature and seemed to be made up of a series of romantic musical phrases spliced together to make a whole. Anne returned to me, let me hold her once again, her body relaxing under my tentative leading. We moved across the floor as one. I smiled at her and was gratified to see that she found me amusing. The look she turned up to me at that moment had me lost for words, thoughts, actions. I barely registered the end of the delectably long tune, surprised, therefore, to see that folks were preparing to leave the establishment. The instruments are being tidied away even as we arrived back to our seats. Anne curtsied to me as she departed with her mother, and I was left wondering if I would ever see her again. Clark Osborne took me by the arm and led me to the counter where he bought us 2 final glasses of whiskey. All Mr. Clark Osborne would offer the lovelorn swain was, "Ah, poor Sancho, I see which way it lies with you. Take heart, soldier. You might see her again once she returns from Scotland with her mistress in the spring." Spring, I thought. Far off spring. Thank you. Final bit, Uncle, final bit. This is like being at the Hackney Empire and getting... I haven't finished. You want me to stop? No. It's only a few minutes, yeah. I'll read quickly. I did warn you it was quite long. Anyway. These forgotten black lives can only be rescued from the woefully threadbare archives by an act of knowledge mixed with an empathetic imagination, what author and historian Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation. Taking from that threadbare archive and creating a story based around other lives similar to the one you are looking at to paint a fuller picture. To achieve this, we must first care, then take the trouble to retell the story as accurately, humanly as possible. While it might be argued that this is less authoritative than a simple laying out of salient facts, the curation involved in the relating of traditional history need be addressed and has been the hidden issue undermining the old ways of reporting history from the start. Objectivity just isn't a human skill when it comes to national history. Hence the need for a plurality of approaches and actors in the field. It comes as a surprise to many to hear that every UK publisher we sent the early manuscript to rejected it out of hand. They claimed it wasn't authentic because Sancho was too articulate to be a victim. Slavery porn, I call it. The need to see us suffer without hearing what we think of our suffering. Dehumanizing the dehumanized once again. But Sancho refused to be silent. He chose to express himself in word, deed, and music. That is why he is a great African Briton, our forerunner. One publisher, however, saw him for who he was. No surprise that that publisher was one of the rare black publishers in the UK. Charmaine Lovegrove, all hail, of Dialogue Publishers. Thank you, Charmaine. Without you, I would still be knocking on doors, probably in vain. The Secret Diaries are, I think, my literary version of a memorial to a forgotten African Briton of great importance to our national story. Through investigating his life, I have managed to unearth truths about many African and Caribbean black British lives. to return to our main subject tonight, the Enslaved Africans Memorial. Monuments are not dead things. They speak to us of who we were. It follows then they speak to us of who we are, at least who we think we are. Because like history, monuments can be curated too. We can leave the statue of Coulson where he rightly belongs, at the bottom of Bristol Harbour, along with the hundreds of captured African souls who drowned shamefully in the seas around Britain. But with others, we may want to leave them where they are and augment them with the truth, exposing crimes and lies, not burying and drowning them. What would such a memorial have meant to me if it had existed when I was growing up, othered in the UK? It would have given me a sense of belonging. Yes. There are the true stories of African civilization prior to European invasions that I first read in Cheikh Anta Diop's extraordinary book, African Civilizations. But like the brilliant pupil who asked her teacher, Oku Ikpenyon, where is our history? I noted that we had nowhere to go to pay tribute to those souls lost in the human trafficking horror. Likewise, nor do our white fellow citizens have a place for them to learn what their ancestors perpetrated on millions of African lives. Let me conclude with why this matters to us as a nation, not just the large black citizenry, but for all of us. A nation is like a family we are randomly born into. We need our story to be told, all our stories, so we know who we are collectively. That story is hard to find. Most don't have that great luxury of the middle and upper classes. Time to sit and study the archives. We're too busy surviving. So the idea of a place, perhaps more than one place, to meditate on these truths is vital. A nation that does not know its own story is like a family without roots or history, doomed to dysfunction, mental anguish, anxiety, and tension. Therapy is needed on a national level to help with this. And we must all agree to support this, or we fall into the mental malaise of denial. And as we all know, that leads to even more dysfunction. As with individuals, so with nations. A monument, a memorial, will aid greatly in the process of healing. Being heard, being seen, as Sancho says in my novel, can be a kind of revolution in our lives. When we're rooted, we can grow, like people, like nations. I fully support the idea of a second Jewish Holocaust memorial. Too many want to whitewash and alter that history already. But why do we not have one? Is it guilt? Shame? A lack of empathy? All of the above. And it costs. Putting our national money where our mouths and morals are will be the sign that we have finally matured as a nation, able to take the burden of history on our shoulders and move into a saner, truer era of relations between the black and white citizens of the United Kingdom. In conclusion, then, I call for the Enslaved Africans Memorial to be erected prominently, permanently in our nation's capital first, and rolled out to other British cities thereafter. We need this as a nation to be mature, honest, and brave enough to face the demons of our past, to pay tribute to the silenced millions who never had a chance to speak for themselves, to declare, as a nation, to the souls who gave their lives to ensure the United Kingdom became a world-leading superpower, that we acknowledge your sacrifice. We see you. We love you. And we will never, ever forget you. Thank you.
thank you, Paterson. That was really, really interesting. So now we've got some time to put some questions to him. So if you'd like to raise your hand, if you've got a question, Kay will be on this side and Gabriel on this side, and they've both got microphones for you to put your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm interested in Sancho's mentorship and friendship of one of the late 18th century's most interesting figures, although he left nothing for us to read. And that's the Jamaican fencing partner of the Duchess of Queensberry, Julius Soubise. Clearly, it was a paternal, perhaps, relationship between a man who'd suffered, or two men who'd suffered, but there was, of course, a generation gap. And I'm wondering how they met. Presumably there was some kind of friendship between the Duke and Duchess of Queensberry and Sancho's associates. But more importantly than that, where Soubise sat among Sancho's sons, did Sancho see him as a son? What was the advice that he gave him? The other question I have, which is something I noticed many years ago, I think West African history can really be characterized as greatly influenced by the decline of the Malinke, the long decline of the Malinke Empire between the mid-16th century and the mid-19th. And in many ways, that event, or that sequence of events, is determinative and in some ways more important than what the European powers did. Now, Sancho's name is still common, as you'll know, in Guyana. It's a very common name in many parts of the Caribbean, but particularly in Guyana. But it also bears an astonishing resemblance to one of the four classes of Malinke nobles. And I wonder sometimes if Sancho actually may have known a little more about his origins than he admitted. So that's my question.
Right, okay, well, thank you. You're obviously very knowledgeable. To those who don't know, Julius Soubise was the ward of the Duchess of Queensberry, Kitty, as she was known. She's quite a wild character, quite a maverick. They were once found in a state of, let's call it, déshabille, when he was in his teens, in her boudoir. So some people wondered whether they were lovers. When you think about that, that's a power relationship right there, right? I mean, he's a little boy when he gets to the household, and there he is, a teenager. He grows up to be a fencing master, an incredible, handsome man, and he teaches the sons and daughters of the gentry to fence and to ride horse. He's brilliant at it. He is a sort of Casanova figure. He gets himself about. And on one of these occasions, he gets himself about a little too much, and the Duchess writes to Sancho. Sancho's older than Soubise. Says basically to him, look at who we are. Look at where we are. Look at the privilege we have when all of our black brothers and sisters are in danger of enslavement or are in slavery or have been murdered by slavery. Please understand your position and act accordingly. And Soubise carries on, and he ends up going to India and basically escaping and dying there by accident, as it were. But the idea that Sancho could be a big brother to this man is true. The community was very small in London. He knew Samuel Johnson, of course. He would have known Handel because he worked for the Montagues, who worked for the royal family, so he would have known that circle. In fact, Johnson was going to apparently write a biography of Sancho's, but a widow distracted him, and he had to help her as her husband had died. So that circle was quite tight. So yeah, there's no reason not to think that they were in the same circle. He certainly wrote to him, and that letter exists in the published letters which you can get today. You talk about the Malinki Empire. I know nothing about that. That's not my area of expertise at all. You know much more than I do, so there's no point in me trying to get into that. So forgive me if I don't answer that question. There's a man right at the back who's had his hand up a couple of times with the glasses. Luke?
Thank you so much for that beautiful story. It was really enthralling. And you also promoted the need for a monument. I think that's really excellent. But there's a more pressing question being put forward almost every day in the newspapers, or at least every week. We see something about reparations for slavery. We see the heirs of slavery apologizing and making some recompense in different places. And the British government is holding out from Tony Blair, has a lot of sorrows and regrets, but no apology, no reparations. We hear the same from Johnson, actually admonishing the now king about raising the question of slavery, as they will fleece you of your money, near enough. And then you just mentioned Sunak, no apology, no reparations. And I wondered what you thought about the case of reparations, which the Caribbean governments have come together and are asking for the government of this country to have a discussion about slavery and about reparations. And just your thoughts.
Thank you. When I first met Oku, we were at Parliament seeing Peggy King George's film, The Story of Bones, about St. Helena that I mentioned earlier. And I said this when we began our discussion: I'm not an activist. I'm an actor. And I happened to find a character that spoke to me both as a black Briton and a performer. And I will never pretend to be anything other than that. That's my level of expertise, if you like. If you were going to ask me how I feel philosophically about reparations, I'd say it's a no-brainer. These things resonate today. If you could look today and say, well, there's no inkling that there was ever slavery, then I would agree with that. But I know too many black boys incarcerated, more than are in college. These are statistical truths, but they're also evidential in the life around me. I see black people struggling to get work. I know people who should get jobs but don't get them, and I know why they don't get them. It still resonates with us today. And the reason is there is no acknowledgement. And for my money, I think the first thing that needs to happen is a national acknowledgement. Perhaps even a day of mourning, a day of regret, a day of... We need something so that there is not even a sense, an absolute knowledge in this country of every man, woman, and child of what was perpetrated to make Britain great. And I think there will be a tide then of people who are very capable of working out how economically we can share the reparations. I mean, the Church of England obviously need to step up. We know how many billions they received. So there is no doubt that there are good people already, but imagine the flood tide if we show and acknowledge that slavery happened and that slavery still resonates today. That, to me, is the end goal, certainly from what I can do, from my angle. I'm not, as I said, a politician, so I create art, I hope. I create people that you can believe in, rooting it in history in the hopes that there will be some sort of enlightenment. It seems vain, but art is like that. I mean, vain in both senses, like, hey, look at me in this great costume, but also vain as in, what's the point? But actually, that's what art is. It's a sort of hope. It's a sort of hope that you fling out there, that someone will catch this, some fire will be set. So whilst I think it's humanly obvious that these things need to be repaired and that reparation, financial reparation, should come, for me, the catalyst will be acknowledgement. Thanks for that question, though.
I think we've got time just...
This lady here, please, yeah.
Okay, my question is to you as an artist. I listened to the presentation, I listened to the work that you did, and what I get is a sense of you having consumed these narratives, digested these narratives, and almost put these narratives through your being to bring them, and your translation of this work, which historians don't actually have to do, but given the void in our history and our transience, we seem pressed to do. And so I wondered that there seemed to me to be two journeys. The work that's been translated through the novel is a manifestation of a journey, but then there's a secondary journey in terms of your journey as an actor, as an individual, consuming these narratives and how you've documented that, because they're not the same thing. And it's about the impact that this kind of work has on you as a person.
That's such a powerful, pertinent question and I'll try and be brief, but very, very insightful. When I used to do the monodrama, would always say at some point, I wrote this play because I wanted to be in a costume drama. And the audience laugh, and I say, well, look, I went to drama school. I was built for that. Hung out with, the theatre giants, the Ray Fiennes and the Simon Russell Beales. And then I'd roll my legs up and I'd do a bit of School for Scandal from Sheridan. And then I'd say, see, I'd be quite good at that. And I'd got into it that way. And in some ways, that was the shallow beginning. I was so often told, oh, gosh, it'd be great to have you in this drama, but there were just no black people before 1948, so we can't. So it was a sort of, if I could find a character, I could give it to somebody who was a proper writer, because I didn't consider myself a writer, though I've been writing since I was about 17. And I'm in my mid-30s at this point. I just hide my stuff in the drawers. I never thought anybody would want to see it. And I finally found this character in Gretchen Gertzinger's Black England, which is a wonderful book, just been reissued with a beautiful preface by Zadie Smith, because we were both influenced by it in the late 90s. And it occurred to me that if I could bring this amazing character with all these stories out, then I could play that character. And I'd probably get a BAFTA, because I've got to have a fat suit, I've got to age myself. It'd be amazing. I'd get an Olivier or something. So it started off really shallowly in some ways. And then the more I delved into it, it was like walking into the sea. You think, oh, I'll do this to that little bit, and then I'll do that. And the fact that I'm standing here in this extraordinary building with this extraordinary woman speaking to this extraordinary crowd about these things would never have occurred to me when I started writing this. But once you open the door and see what was missing, it becomes a sort of energy, a kind of outrage. And if you don't channel it, therein madness lies. So my only way was to express it through the love I have of bringing people to life in my body and in my mind. Sancho sits above my dining table. I honestly think now that I'm possessed by him in some way. And I accept that ancestrally. But great question.
I think we can just have this lady.
I just want to make a comment, and it's really a Me Too comment.
Is it?
No. I'll try and project.
You've got a great voice, you'll find
my comment is really, it's not a black and white issue. I think there's a wider conversation here, and I think it's diminished if it is only a black and white issue. That's just one comment. And the second bit is that I really believe that because people don't know the history, they can't be empathetic to it. And it beggars belief that the Foreign Office are inviting people like William Dalrymple to come and tell them their history, because they were never taught that in school. And we're not talking about, we're talking about the elite of this country. We're not talking about people who weren't interested in being educated. And my plea would be, using art captures people's hearts and minds. And the power of exhibitions and installations in London will go an enormous way to helping inform people. So that would be my one plea.
I think that's a great way to end it, because that's what you've said. I totally agree.
Okay. Well, just to conclude this part, the director, Professor Kingsley Abbott, is going to say a few words. Kingsley.
Good evening, everybody. I will be brief. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening at Senate House. And I'd like to begin by thanking Paterson Joseph for giving generously of his time tonight and for your powerful words. The wickedness continues. I wish that we had all of London in here tonight to have heard you speak. And also to Oku and her team, Audrey, for bringing us all together. When I joined the Institute as its new director just recently in April this year, Oku was one of the first people I met. And if you don't mind me saying, Oku, the thing that struck me the most when we met was your clarity of vision and purpose behind Memorial 2007, which is education, as you've told me every time we've talked. And although I have English and Irish and Welsh and Scottish ancestry, I'm a newcomer to the UK. I've never lived here before. I'm from New Zealand originally. And I was astonished to learn from Oku that in a city filled with statues and memorials, which I've walked around since I arrived, and something that strikes any visitor to London, London wanting to project its history and its story, I was astonished to learn that there is no memorial that specifically exists for victims of slavery. That simply has to be remedied as a way of acknowledging and reckoning with the past. So as we've heard tonight, that future generations can use it as a focal point to learn the truth about what happened. And having worked on justice issues and accountability, which is my expertise, in different parts of the world, which has very much been my privilege, working to support civil society and victims groups and victims of serious human rights violations, of which slavery is one. I have seen and been told about the power of memorials when done carefully and sensitively and alongside affected communities. They can have a powerful impact on not only establishing the truth, but also on recognition and returning dignity to victims and those affected, on accountability and justice, and on the right to remedies and reparations, which all victims of serious human rights violations have. The second thing that struck me, Oku, is that you've already taken this so far. You've already, done so much of the work. And I want to draw everyone's attention to the maquette out in the corridor. It's not just an idea to have a memorial. A memorial has been produced in a maquette and very thoughtfully done. So I would ask all of you, if you've missed it on the way in, to take a look on the way out. And while these campaigns, like this campaign, Memorial 2007, require our solidarity and support, I can say they also require resources. And tonight's not about fundraising, it's about education. But Memorial 2007 does not receive any public funding and is run by a small team of volunteers. So if you feel able to, and no pressure, if you feel inclined to make a donation, please have a chat to Oku later on. Finally, I just want to say that we have on the table Paterson Joseph's book, and I'm sure he would be happy to sign one for you. And I also think we have some books on Black History Walks in London. I didn't quite catch the gentleman's name, but I think it's Tony. So please have a chat to Tony as well. And stay around for some refreshments. Let's take the opportunity of coming together to meet one another. And I'd also like to just finish by thanking my colleague Kay, who I have seen behind the scenes has offered so much support to Oku. So thank you, Paterson Joseph. Thanks, Oku. Thanks, Oku and your team, and to Kay. And good evening, everybody.